Rome, AD 161. Night had descended upon the eternal city, wrapping the marble columns of its temples and the towering insulae in deep violet twilight. From the Palatine Hill, the very heart of Roman power, where the air itself seemed saturated with stories of triumph and betrayal, a heavy silence reigned. In the palace of Emperor Antoninus Pius, known to history as the Pius for his devotion and justice, not only the day was fading, but an entire era was quietly drawing to a close. The age of peace, known as the Roman peace, Pax Romana, had reached its zenith, its golden dusk, and now stood on the threshold of the unknown. The old emperor, who had ruled for 23 years with wisdom and moderation unmatched since the legendary King Numa Pompilius, lay on his deathbed. His breathing was uneven, like the final pulses of a heart that had sustained an empire. At his bedside, in the flickering light of oil lamps, stood two men. Two heirs, their destinies bound together by the will of their adoptive father and the mysterious designs of fate. One, the emperor's nephew, was tall and handsome, his features already hinting at future indulgence and a love of pleasure. His name was Lucius Verus. The other, Antoninus' son-in-law, was of a different nature, of moderate height, with a thoughtful, penetrating gaze of brown eyes and a beard worn in the style of Greek philosophers. He radiated a calm, inner strength that seemed almost out of place in this dwelling of supreme power. His name was Marcus Aurelius. No one present could yet foresee that the calm so carefully preserved by Antoninus was only the stillness before a storm of unprecedented force. From the east came troubling whispers of unrest in the powerful Parthian Empire. To the north, beyond the Danube, barbarian tribes long dormant were beginning to gather, like predators sensing weakness in their prey. And within the empire itself, deep in its arteries, an invisible plague was already waiting, one that would soon sweep through cities and villages with a fury capable of eclipsing any war. Summoning his last strength, Antoninus Pius turned to the prefect of the Praetorian Guard and spoke his final word, his last password for the centuries. It was not the name of a god, nor a call for glory, but a single Latin concept that had become the essence of his reign and his final testament to the future. He spoke the word equanimitas, equanimity, inner balance, serenity of the soul. Then he turned toward the wall and quietly passed away, as if falling asleep. At that moment, as the emperor's breath ceased, the full weight of the world, the fate of tens of millions of souls, settled upon the shoulders of a man who desired power less than anyone alive. A man who longed for the quiet of a philosophical school, for conversations with sages, for the search for truth within the depths of his own mind. But the gods, or fate, in which he so deeply believed, had decided otherwise. The age of calm had ended. The age of Marcus Aurelius was about to begin, an age of wars, plague, rebellions, and the greatest philosophical trial ever faced by a ruler. This is the story of the last of the 5 good emperors, a philosopher on the throne, whose life became a tragic poem about duty, honor, and the eternal struggle of a human being with fate and with himself. A story carved not only into triumphal arches, but also into the pages of a private diary, written in a military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube, beneath the howl of barbarian horns and the whisper of eternity. Before the philosopher ascended the Palatine Hill clad in imperial purple, a boy was growing up far from the glare of court life, in the quiet gardens of the Celian Hill. A boy destined to become that philosopher. His name was Marcus Annius Verus. In his veins flowed the blood of ancient Italian aristocrats and immensely wealthy Spanish senators. Yet from early childhood, his soul was drawn not to gold or power, but to the stars, to knowledge, to the severe simplicity of Stoic wisdom. No one could have imagined that this serious, contemplative child would one day wear the imperial crown. His path to supreme power would be winding and paradoxical, shaped not by ambition, but by a chain of deaths and the strange will of one of Rome's most enigmatic emperors. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, AD 121, in Rome, into one of the most noble and influential families of his time. His full birth name, Marcus Annius Verus, was itself a mark of belonging to the highest ranks of Roman society. The Annii family, of Italian origin, had risen to prominence through immense wealth accumulated in the Spanish province of Baetica, the heart of olive oil production, known in antiquity as liquid gold. His great-grandfather had been the first in the family to enter the Senate. His grandfather, bearing the same name, served as consul 3 times and even held the office of prefect of Rome. Marcus' father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, enjoyed a promising but brief career as praetor before dying when his son was only 3 years old. His mother, Domitia Lucilla the Younger, came from a consular family and inherited a vast fortune, including a large brickworks on the outskirts of Rome, an enterprise that supplied materials for imperial construction projects across the empire. From birth, Marcus was surrounded not only by luxury, but by an atmosphere of responsibility, administration, and service to the state. After his father's death, he was adopted by his paternal grandfather and raised on the Celian Hill in a household marked by traditional discipline, reverence for ancestral customs, and deep religiosity. His childhood education was exemplary. He received an outstanding private education and early on displayed remarkable seriousness and a thirst for knowledge. In later reflections, he would gratefully recall his teachers. From his ancestors he learned good character and gentleness. From the memory of his father, modesty and courage. From his mother, piety, generosity, and restraint, not only from bad actions, but even from bad thoughts. A true turning point came when Marcus was 11 years old, when he met the artist and philosopher Diognetus. More than a teacher of painting, Diognetus introduced him to the world of Stoicism. He taught Marcus to disdain empty superstition, to reject tales of miracles and magic, to distrust slanderers, and to devote himself to philosophy. Under his influence, Marcus embraced Stoic austerity so intensely that it alarmed his mother. He began sleeping on the bare ground, covered only by a rough cloak, and only with great effort did Domitia Lucilla persuade him to return to a bed covered with animal skins. This was no childish whim. It was the first manifestation of the willpower and inner discipline that would define his entire life. He donned the philosopher's cloak, a symbolic garment opposed to the purple toga of senators, and carried it within his soul even when forced to wear imperial purple. Fate intervened decisively when Emperor Hadrian took notice of the boy. Hadrian, ruler from 117 to 138, was a complex figure, an aesthete, traveler, poet, architect, and ruthless politician. His wife, Vibia Sabina, was a distant relative of Marcus. Impressed by the boy's seriousness and honesty, Hadrian affectionately nicknamed him Verissimus, the most truthful, a playful reference to his family name, Verus, meaning true. This imperial favor was more than praise. it was a sign. At the age of 6, Marcus was admitted into a prestigious priestly college, a rare honor. He performed his duties diligently, memorizing ancient hymns and rituals. But the true drama centered on succession. Hadrian had no children, and the question of an heir was urgent. In 136, he adopted Lucius Aelius Caesar and betrothed young Marcus to Aelius' daughter. Marcus, then 15, submitted to the emperor's will. Fate intervened again. On January 1, 138, Lucius Aelius died suddenly. Gravely ill himself, Hadrian was forced to make a final decision, one of the strangest and most far-sighted in Roman history. On February 25, 138, he adopted the 51-year-old senator Titus Aurelius Fulvus Bonius Arius Antoninus, future Antoninus Pius, on one condition: Antoninus must immediately adopt 2 boys. One was Lucius Verus, the son of the deceased Aelius. The other was Marcus Annius Verus. In a single day, Marcus became Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus, member of the imperial family and heir to the throne. His previous engagement was annulled, and he was betrothed to Antoninus' daughter, Faustina the Younger. Torn from his quiet philosophical life, Marcus was thrust into the center of imperial politics. The path to power was open, but it was not one he had chosen. And so the young Stoic accepted it with the same seriousness with which he had once accepted the philosopher's cloak. It might seem that the fate of the young Marcus was already decided. He was the heir of an heir, a prince whose future had been planned decades in advance. But what if the throne was not the goal, but merely a long, almost endless prelude? What if the waiting itself became the greatest lesson of his life? For 23 years, Marcus Aurelius lived in the shadow of his adoptive father, Emperor Antoninus Pius. It was a time of long and meticulous apprenticeship, a period in which his character was tempered and his intellect sharpened. Yet it was also a time of inner struggle, a tension between the quiet allure of philosophy and the relentless demands of public service, between the silence of the library and the restless noise of the Roman Forum. These 2 decades of peace would transform the youth into a man. But they would also become the final peaceful chapter in both his own life and in the life of the empire itself. The reign of Antoninus Pius, from 138 to 161 AD, entered history as the golden age of the Roman Empire, the high point of what is known as the Pax Romana. It was an era of stability, prosperity, and an almost complete absence of major wars. Antoninus himself stood as a model ruler, modest, just, meticulous in administration, and deeply respectful of the Senate. He never left the borders of Italy, governing the vast empire from his estate in Lorium, setting an example of moderation and frugality. For the young Marcus Aurelius, he became not only an adoptive father and emperor, but the foremost teacher of life and statecraft. In his meditations, Marcus would later describe Antoninus with profound gratitude and admiration. From him, Marcus learned gentleness, unwavering commitment to carefully considered decisions, a complete absence of vanity, love of labor, and quiet perseverance. He observed how Antoninus listened attentively to anyone who offered something useful for the common good, how he maintained friendships without clinging to them or falling into excessive attachment, how he remained self-sufficient in all things. This was a living embodiment of the Stoic ideal of a wise man in power, and Marcus absorbed this example daily for 23 years. Immediately after his adoption, Marcus moved into Hadrian's former private residence, the so-called Tiberian House on the Palatine Hill. His status changed irrevocably. In the year 139, at the age of 18, he was appointed Caesar, the official heir to the throne. He gained the right to speak in the Senate. His name began to appear on coins. Antoninus methodically and consistently introduced him to the mechanisms of governance. Marcus held the office of consul, first in 140 AD, and received tribunician power and proconsular authority, sharing with the emperor the burdens of rule. He studied jurisprudence under the greatest legal minds of his era, men such as Lucius Verus Maecianus, and soon became a respected authority himself, actively participating in judicial proceedings and legal deliberations. Yet alongside his public duties, his philosophical education continued, and now reached its peak. Recognizing his adopted son's passion for wisdom, Antoninus surrounded him with the finest intellectuals of the age. Among Marcus's teachers were the peripatetic Claudius Severus and the Platonist Alexander of Seleucia. But two figures occupied a central place above all others: the Stoic Quintus Junius Rusticus and the Roman knight Marcus Cornelius Fronto. Junius Rusticus, the grandson of the renowned Stoic martyr Aurelius Rusticus, executed under Emperor Domitian, became Marcus's principal guide into the world of Stoic philosophy. It was he who, as Marcus himself later wrote, gave him the writings of Epictetus, texts that would become the future emperor's constant companion and lifelong reference. Rusticus taught him to avoid rhetorical vanity, to write plainly and honestly, and most importantly, showed him that philosophy was not an abstract discipline but a practical guide to living, an art of correcting and healing one's own character. Philosophy, in Rusticus' view, was a daily exercise of the soul. His relationship with Fronto, however, was entirely different. Fronto was the most celebrated advocate and orator of his age, a master of Latin rhetoric whose fame echoed throughout the empire. Fronto instructed both Marcus and Lucius Verus in the art of eloquence. The surviving correspondence between Fronto and Marcus is a priceless historical document, offering a rare glimpse into the inner world of the future emperor. Fronto adored his gifted student, yet he was deeply troubled by Marcus's excessive devotion to philosophy. He tried to convince him that for a future ruler, rhetorical skill mattered far more than Stoic paradoxes, the ability to command language, to persuade the Senate and the people. In one letter, Fronto warned him, "If you strip rhetoric of its power to magnify the small, diminish the great, and present the old as new, then your philosopher will wander naked, begging for alms." Marcus, while maintaining deep respect for his teacher, defended his choice politely but firmly. His letters reveal a growing weariness with empty rhetoric, with the hunt for rare words and inflated style. He wrote openly to Fronto about his love for philosophy. "As for me, I would sooner renounce life itself than abandon the pursuit of wisdom." This conflict, between rhetoric and philosophy, between outward brilliance and inner truth, became central to Marcus's spiritual formation. He chose truth. He chose Stoicism not as an intellectual exercise, but as the only possible way to live a life with dignity. In the year 145, an important event took place. Marcus married his cousin, Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius. He was 24 years old, she was about 15. Their marriage, which lasted 30 years, was complex and surrounded by rumors. Ancient historians, especially the unreliable authors of the Historia Augusta, accused Faustina of numerous infidelities, moral excess, and affairs with gladiators and sailors. Yet Marcus himself speaks of her in his Meditations with unwavering affection and tenderness, thanking the gods for a wife who was so obedient, so loving, and so simple. He valued her loyalty and support deeply. Over the course of their marriage, they had no fewer than 13 children, but most died in infancy or early youth, a succession of devastating personal tragedies for Marcus. Only one son, Commodus, and 4 daughters survived. The years passed. Marcus continued to fulfill his duties with quiet diligence, remaining in the shadow of the pious emperor. He was the ideal heir, loyal, hard-working, modest. He wove no intrigues and made no attempt to hasten his ascent to power. On the contrary, the very idea of supreme authority frightened him. He saw power not as a privilege, but as a crushing burden, a form of service that would rob him of what he valued most: time for solitude and philosophical reflection. He learned to govern the empire, but even more earnestly, he learned to govern himself. This long, almost meditative waiting, 23 years in duration, became the perfect preparation for the terrifying trials that would descend upon him the very moment he finally donned the imperial purple. Rome had never witnessed anything like what followed. Traditionally, when one emperor died, a single heir took his place. It had always been so. But on that cold day in March of 161, when the Senate gathered to transfer power to Marcus Aurelius, the unthinkable occurred. The man standing on the threshold of absolute authority voluntarily refused its full extent. Marcus demanded that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, stand beside him with equal titles and honors. This was not merely an act of modesty or brotherly affection. It was a political precedent that forever altered the nature of imperial power in Rome. Why did a philosopher who despised worldly vanity choose to share his burden? Was this an expression of Stoic humility, or the calculated move of a far-sighted statesman who already sensed the rumble of an approaching storm and understood that he could not face it alone? After the death of Antoninus Pius on March 7, 161, the Senate unanimously proclaimed Marcus Aurelius sole emperor. All the titles of his predecessor, Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, Father of the Fatherland, were offered to him alone. Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, remained in the background, just as he had during Antoninus' lifetime. But Marcus astonished the senators by refusing sole rule. He declared that he would not assume office unless Lucius received exactly the same powers as himself. This decision was unprecedented. For the first time in Roman history, the empire had 2 full emperors, 2 Augusti. Marcus, older in age and greater in authority, remained the dominant figure. He assumed the title of Pontifex Maximus, which only one man could hold, yet formally their power was equal. Lucius Verus, now about 30 years old, was transformed from a secondary heir into a co-ruler. He took the name Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus, while Marcus became Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. The motives behind this decision remain debated among historians. On one hand, it was an extraordinary act of loyalty to the will of Hadrian, who had originally intended both men to rule. It reflected the Stoic principle of justice and shared responsibility. Marcus may genuinely have wished to avoid the full weight of power. On the other hand, it was a shrewd political move. Lucius Verus was popular with the soldiers. He was the complete opposite of the introspective and austere Marcus, handsome, charismatic, fond of feasts, hunting, and gladiatorial games. By elevating him to co-emperor, Marcus not only neutralized a potential rival who could have become a focal point of opposition, but also gained something akin to a minister of war, someone capable of commanding armies in the conflicts to come. Marcus, the philosopher and jurist, preferred to remain in Rome, overseeing civil administration, while the more martial Lucius could lead campaigns in the field. Perhaps Marcus already foresaw that governing an empire on the brink of total war on multiple fronts would be impossible alone. And the storms did not delay. The golden age of Antoninus ended almost the very day he died. As if a malignant force had been unleashed upon the empire, disasters began to fall one after another. Soon after the new emperors came to power, the Tiber overflowed its banks, flooding the lower districts of Rome. The flood destroyed vast grain reserves and state warehouses, leading to famine and a sharp rise in food prices. Marcus and Lucius acted immediately, organizing grain shipments from the provinces and personally supervising distribution, thereby preventing unrest. But this was only the beginning. Far graver threats gathered along the borders. In Britain, unrest erupted. Along the German frontier, the Chatti tribe invaded Upper Germany and Rhaetia. Yet the most terrible blow came from the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's oldest and most powerful rival in the east, chose to exploit the change of power. King Vologases I, ambitious and warlike, judged the moment perfect for revenge. In the autumn of 161, Parthian forces invaded Armenia, a buffer state between the two empires, expelled the Roman client king, and installed their own. They then advanced into Syria. The Roman legate of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, an overconfident Gaul who trusted the prophecies of the false prophet Alexander of Abinoticus, marched out with a single legion to confront them. At the Battle of Allegia, his army was annihilated, and Severianus took his own life. The road into the heart of the Roman East lay open. Panic swept through Syria. The situation was critical. Immediate and decisive action was required, and here Marcus's plan of dual rule proved its worth. It was decided that Lucius Verus would personally travel east and take command of the Roman forces. For Marcus, this was the ideal solution. He remained in Rome as chief strategist and administrator, managing the state, containing the German threat, and addressing the aftermath of famine. Lucius, whose reputation demanded military glory, received his opportunity. In 162, Lucius Verus set out on campaign with great pomp. His journey east resembled a triumphal procession more than a hurried deployment. He stopped in many cities, hosted feasts and hunts, and indulged in the luxuries of the eastern provinces. Ancient sources portray him as a frivolous pleasure-seeker who lingered in Antioch while his generals fought the war. Modern historians, however, consider this portrayal exaggerated. Lucius may not have been a brilliant commander, but he was the embodiment of imperial authority at the front. He assembled a formidable army and entrusted command to outstanding generals, notably Statius Priscus and, most importantly, Gaius Avidius Cassius. These men became the true architects of victory. The war was long and brutal, lasting 4 years from 162 to 166. Roman forces advanced methodically and mercilessly. They first expelled the Parthians from Armenia, destroying its capital Artaxata. Then the war shifted to Mesopotamia. In 165, Avidius Cassius stormed and completely destroyed two of Parthia's greatest cities, Seleucia on the Tigris and the capital, Ctesiphon. It was a devastating blow from which the Parthian kingdom never fully recovered. In 166, Vologases I was forced to sue for peace. Rome annexed northwestern Mesopotamia, restored control over Armenia, and returned laden with immense spoils. Victory was total. In October 166, Marcus and Lucius celebrated a magnificent triumph in Rome. Both emperors received the title Parthicus Maximus. Marcus's sons, Commodus and Lucius Verus, were granted the title of Caesar. It seemed that the first storm had passed, and that under the wise leadership of two Augusti, the empire had proven its unshakable strength. But the triumphal chariots entering Rome carried more than glory and treasure. Hidden among the returning legions traveled an invisible and merciless enemy, one that would bring far more death and suffering than all Parthian arrows combined. The age of the Great Plague was beginning. Rome rejoiced. Streets were strewn with flowers, the air trembled with the roar of the cheering crowd. Two emperors, Marcus and Lucius, rode toward the capital in gilded chariots, leading Parthian captives and displaying the immeasurable riches of the East. The triumph of 166 was the apex of glory, a symbol of the invincibility of Roman arms. Yet, while the city reveled in victory, in its narrow streets and luxurious villas an invisible enemy had already begun its silent, deadly harvest. The legionaries returning from the east brought with them not only triumph, but a pestilence that would enter history as the Antonine Plague. This epidemic would become a demographic catastrophe, undermining the strength of the empire, emptying its cities and villages, and forever altering the face of the Roman world. The greatest triumph turned into the greatest tragedy. Victory over Parthia was absolute. Roman eagles once again flew over Mesopotamia. Lucius Verus, returning to Rome, basked in the glow of fame. Marcus Aurelius, as supreme ruler, shared all honors with him. He even betrothed his eldest daughter, the 12-year-old Lucilla, to the 36-year-old Lucius, further strengthening their dynastic bond. The empire seemed to stand at the height of its power, and yet it was precisely at this moment of triumph that the first signs of catastrophe appeared. Soldiers returning from Mesopotamia began dying of a strange illness. Soon it spread to the civilian population. The epidemic, which likely originated during the siege of Seleucia in 165, now raced across the empire with the returning army like a wildfire. It followed trade routes, reaching even the most distant corners of the Roman world, from Syria to Gaul and the banks of the Rhine. This was the Antonine Plague, named after Marcus's family name. Modern scholars, relying on descriptions left by the famous physician Galen, believe it was a form of hemorrhagic smallpox, among the deadliest manifestations of the disease. Galen, who personally observed patients in Rome, described fever, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat, and most characteristically, black or dark red skin eruptions that later crusted over. Mortality was horrific. In some regions, up to a third of the population is believed to have perished. In Rome itself, thousands died each day. Bodies were burned on massive pyres or thrown into mass graves. The consequences of the epidemic were catastrophic and far-reaching. A true demographic collapse occurred. By various estimates, The empire lost between 7 and 10 million people. Some sources suggest as much as 15 to 20% of the entire population. Entire villages and cities were abandoned. The army suffered especially badly. Legions stationed on the frontiers dwindled rapidly, sharply weakening the empire's defenses. Marcus Aurelius was forced to take extreme measures, recruiting slaves, gladiators, and even barbarians from beyond the Rhine and Danube, something previously unthinkable. An economic crisis followed. The sudden population decline caused labor shortages in agriculture and crafts. Fields lay unplanted, mines were abandoned, production fell, and trade stagnated. State revenues from taxes plummeted, while expenditures, especially military costs, continued to rise. To cover the deficit, Marcus was forced to debase the coinage, reducing the silver content of the denarius, a measure that fueled long-term inflation. Society suffered a profound psychological shock. Panic and despair spread. People did not understand the causes of the disease and saw it as divine punishment. Across the empire, persecutions of Christians intensified. They were accused of angering the gods by refusing to honor traditional Roman deities. Lynchings and trials multiplied, the most famous being the trial of the martyrs of Lyon in 177. Superstitions flourished. Charlatans and magicians sold amulets and spells. Many sought salvation in mystical cults, the cult of the Egyptian Isis, or that of the Phrygian Cybele. Marcus Aurelius, as supreme ruler and high priest, stood at the center of this storm. His response became a model of Stoic self-control and duty. He did not succumb to panic. Instead, he took decisive action. First, he sought to appease the gods. Grand religious ceremonies were held in Rome, including lectisternia, ritual banquets for the gods, during which statues were placed upon ceremonial couches. Priests of all cults were summoned, and countless sacrifices were offered. He sought to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods that Romans believed essential to the state's prosperity. Second, he organized practical measures against the plague's consequences. Laws were issued regulating burials and urban sanitation. The great physician Galen was summoned to Rome and appointed personal doctor to the imperial family. His knowledge was applied in the struggle against the epidemic, though ancient medicine was powerless against the virus. Third, and this was the most astonishing step, Marcus addressed the financial crisis directly. The treasury was empty. To fund the army and maintain the state, in 169 he organized an unprecedented auction in the Forum of Trajan. He placed the personal property of the imperial family up for sale: gold and silver tableware, jeweled goblets, luxurious garments belonging to his wife Faustina, silk embroidered with gold, and rare works of art inherited from Hadrian himself. The auction lasted 2 months and raised enormous sums, allowing the state to function without imposing new taxes. This act made a profound impression on the Roman people. An emperor selling his personal possessions to save the state became a living symbol of service and self-sacrifice. The plague raged at least until 180, subsiding and flaring up repeatedly. It formed the dark backdrop of Marcus Aurelius' entire later reign. It exhausted the empire, leaving it vulnerable, and enemies did not delay. While Rome fought an invisible enemy within, storm clouds gathered along its northern frontier. The weakened, blood-drained empire stood on the threshold of the Marcomannic Wars, the most brutal and prolonged conflict since the Punic Wars. The Danubian frontier, long considered relatively calm, suddenly erupted. For years, legions had languished in their camps while barbarians traded with Rome or fought among themselves. But while Rome celebrated victory over Parthia and suffocated under plague, entire peoples of Central and Eastern Europe were set in motion. Like a tectonic shift, the great migration of the Goths from the north pushed Germanic and Sarmatian tribes toward the imperial borders. They no longer sought land or alliances. They came for plunder and living space, united in powerful confederations and prepared for anything. In 166 or 167, this human avalanche broke through the Danubian frontier. For Marcus Aurelius, the most terrible war of his life began, a war that would last until his death and demand the full exertion of both emperor and empire. The Marcomannic Wars is a collective term for a series of conflicts fought between 166 and 180 against a vast coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes. At its core were the Marcomanni, living in modern-day Czechia, and the Quadi of Slovakia. But dozens of other peoples joined them: the Iazyges, Vandals, Lombards, Buri, Neristi, and many more. The causes were complex. First, pressure from the Goths migrating from Scandinavia toward the Black Sea. Second, overpopulation and climatic deterioration within Germania itself. Third, the barbarians saw that the Roman Empire was weakened by plague and Eastern war. They smelled blood. The first incursion came in 166 or 167, when a force of 6,000 Lombards and Ubii crossed the Danube into Pannonia, only to be repelled by local forces. But this was merely a probing attack. Soon afterward, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and others demanded permission to settle on imperial territory. When refused, they launched full-scale war. Rome's situation was desperate. The army was exhausted by the Eastern War and decimated by plague. 2 new legions had to be formed from scratch, the 2nd and 3rd Italic legions. The treasury was empty. It was then that Marcus conducted his famous auction. In the autumn of 167, both emperors, Marcus and Lucius, personally traveled north to Aquileia to lead the defense. The mere fact that both Augusti left Rome spoke to the severity of the threat. The opening phase of the war was catastrophic. Barbarian forces broke through the Danubian defenses across a wide front. The Marcomanni and Quadi crossed the Alps and invaded northern Italy, an unthinkable shock. For the first time since the Cimbrian War 250 years earlier, an enemy stood on sacred Italian soil. The barbarians destroyed the city of Apaturgium, modern Oderzo, and besieged Aquileia itself. The Praetorian prefect Titurius Victorinus attempted to stop them but was defeated and killed. Panic seized Rome. The city had not seen an enemy so close since Hannibal. Marcus ordered the urgent restoration of Rome's walls, neglected since the Republican era. In this critical moment, Marcus proved himself a calm and resolute commander. He organized the defense of Italy, redeployed legions from the Rhine and other provinces, halted the barbarian advance, and drove them back from Aquileia. Gradually, at enormous cost, Roman forces pushed the invaders back beyond the Alps. But in early 169, as the emperors returned from Aquileia, disaster struck again. Lucius Verus, never robust in health and likely weakened by the plague, suddenly died of a stroke. Marcus Aurelius was left alone, face to face with war and an empire in crisis. He brought his brother's body back to Rome, held lavish funeral rites, and deified him. Now the full burden of power and responsibility rested on Marcus alone. From that moment on, Marcus Aurelius remained almost permanently on the Danubian frontier. His main headquarters became Carnuntum in Pannonia, near modern Vienna. The war turned into a grueling sequence of brutal campaigns. This was not a classical war of decisive battles, but endless guerrilla fighting in forests and swamps, punitive expeditions, sieges of barbarian settlements, and constant defense against raids. In 170, the empire suffered another devastating defeat. 20,000 Roman soldiers were annihilated in a battle whose location remains unknown. The governor of Pannonia was killed. The Costoboci tribe broke through Moesia and Thrace, reached Greece, and sacked the sacred sanctuary at Eleusis. Yet Marcus did not surrender. He methodically rebuilt the army and the frontier. He divided the Danubian front into two sectors. He personally commanded operations against the Marcomannic Wars, while entrusting the eastern sector against the Sarmatian Iazyges to capable generals such as the future Emperor Pertinax. Step by step, with extraordinary perseverance, the Romans began to turn the tide. Two famous episodes from this period were later proclaimed miracles by Roman propaganda. The first, known as the Miracle of the Rain, occurred around 172. During a campaign deep in Quadi territory, a Roman army was surrounded and suffering from thirst under the blazing sun. When destruction seemed inevitable, a violent storm erupted. Torrential rain saved the Roman soldiers, while lightning and hail struck the barbarians, causing panic and allowing the Romans to prevail. Pagan authors attributed the miracle to Marcus's prayers and Jupiter's intervention. Christian apologists, such as Tertullian, claimed it occurred due to the prayers of Christian soldiers from the 12th Lightning Legion. The second episode, the Miracle of the Lightning, occurred around 173. During a battle against the Iazyges, a massive barbarian siege engine was destroyed by a lightning strike. This too was interpreted as divine favor. Both miracles were immediately commemorated on coins and on the reliefs of the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, powerful propaganda tools that bolstered morale. By 175, at the cost of staggering losses, Marcus achieved victory in the war's first phase. He defeated the Marcomannic Wars and prepared to transform their lands, along with those of the Iazyges, into new Roman provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This would have pushed the frontier far north and east, creating a buffer zone and securing Italy permanently. But at the very moment when victory seemed within reach, news arrived that struck him like a dagger from behind. A rebellion had erupted in the east. Imagine the scene. A bitter night on the frozen banks of the Danube. Outside the thin canvas of a military tent, icy winds howl and sentries shout. Around lies the camp of an exhausted, blood-drained army locked in endless war. Inside, by the dim light of an oil lamp, sits a man wrapped in a simple soldier's cloak. This is the ruler of the world, Emperor Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. Yet he is not writing orders or battle reports. He writes for himself. Short notes, aphorisms, instructions to his own soul. Amid chaos, blood, and death, he seeks order, meaning, and inner peace. Here, at the edge of civilization, in the heart of the barbarian world, one of humanity's greatest philosophical works is born, a book later known as Meditations. Meditations is a unique monument of the human spirit. It is not a treatise intended for publication, not a sermon to disciples. It is a private diary, an intimate conversation with one's own soul, written during the most difficult years of Marcus's life, largely amid the Marcomannic Wars. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, not Latin, the language of power and law. Some entries bear headings like, "Among the Quadi on the Granua," or "At Carnuntum." These were daily exercises, spiritual training that allowed him to retain humanity and sanity under inhuman conditions. To understand their depth, one must always remember the context of their creation. Marcus, a man who valued silence, peace, and contemplation above all else, was forced to spend nearly 10 years immersed in violence. He saw death daily. He made decisions affecting thousands of lives. He bore responsibility for a crumbling empire. Stoic philosophy became not an intellectual hobby, but a lifeline. At the core of Meditations lies the Stoic doctrine of the dichotomy of control. Some things are within our power, others are not. Our thoughts, judgments, desires, and attitudes are within our control. Our body, health, reputation, other people's actions, natural disasters, war, death, these are not. Happiness and tranquility, according to the Stoics, lie in focusing all effort on what we can control and accepting everything else as part of the cosmic order governed by divine reason, the Logos. Marcus constantly reminds himself of this. Be like a rock against which the waves continually break. It stands firm, and the water around it grows calm. He teaches himself to view the horrors of war through the eyes of philosophy. Death is a natural dissolution into first elements. Pain is merely a bodily sensation that need not disturb the ruling part of the soul. Enemies act wrongly out of ignorance, not knowing true good and evil. They should be pitied, not hated. The best revenge, he writes, is not to be like the wrongdoer. Another central theme is impermanence. Marcus meditates endlessly on time. He imagines the infinite abyss of past and future, and sees how insignificant a human life truly is. Alexander the Great and his mule driver are now in the same condition, either absorbed back into the universal logos or dispersed into atoms. Glory, wealth, power, all are smoke and dust. This realization does not depress him, it frees him. If all things pass, there is no reason to cling to them or suffer their loss. The only thing that matters is to live one's brief life with dignity, in harmony with nature, one's rational nature, and the universal logos. From this flows the third key idea, duty. To live according to nature, for a social being, means to serve the common good. What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee. Marcus viewed imperial power not as privilege, but as service to humanity. He reminds himself to rise from bed each morning, even when he does not wish to, because he has work to do. He must be just, merciful, honest, and courageous, not for heavenly reward, but because it is his duty as a human being and an emperor. Meditations is a remarkable document of the human spirit. It lacks systematic structure. Thoughts repeat, wander, overlap. Yet this very chaos gives the work its power and authenticity. We see not a polished philosophical facade, but a living man struggling with himself. We see his fatigue, his disgust with courtly flattery, his effort to remain humane. Each morning he tells himself, "Today I shall meet meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial people." And then he reminds himself not to be angry, for they are kin, fragments of the same universal reason. The book is the quintessence of Marcus Aurelius himself, a man of absolute power writing a hymn to restraint, a general waging brutal war preaching forgiveness and love for humanity, a ruler surrounded by luxury meditating on the worthlessness of earthly things. Meditations is not merely philosophy. It is a manual for the survival of the soul in hell. And the fact that it was written on the battlefield makes it one of the most powerful and inspiring testimonies of human resilience ever created. Victory on the Danube seemed close. Exhausted by years of war, Marcus Aurelius prepared to found new provinces and secure the northern frontier once and for all. It seemed the goal of his life was within reach. And then, like a knife thrust from the shadows, news arrived from the east. Gaius Avidius Cassius, the empire's most celebrated general, hero of the Parthian War, governor of the entire east, had declared himself emperor. The revolt was not led by some obscure adventurer, but by a man Marcus trusted implicitly. An empire already torn by war and plague now stood on the brink of civil war. For the Stoic on the throne, this was more than political betrayal. It was a blow to his faith in humanity, and the harshest test of his philosophical convictions. Gaius Avidius Cassius was a striking and charismatic figure. He was born in the Syrian city of Cyrrhus. His father was a prominent equestrian, and Cassius went on to build a brilliant military career. He was a true soldier's general, harsh, demanding, and uncompromising in maintaining iron discipline within the ranks. Legends circulated about his severity. It was said that he ordered the hands of deserters to be cut off and rebellious centurions to be crucified. Yet the soldiers both feared and respected him. It was Cassius who became the chief architect of victory in the Parthian War. His legions captured Ctesiphon. After the war, Marcus Aurelius appointed him governor of Syria and later granted him extraordinary authority over all the eastern provinces, from Egypt to Cappadocia. In effect, Cassius became the viceroy of the East. What, then, drove him to rebellion? The reasons were complex. First, there were his personal ambitions. He considered himself more worthy of the throne than the philosophizing old man Marcus. He presented himself as a proponent of firm rule, arguing that the empire needed discipline, not philosophical reflection. Second, he was supported by the Eastern aristocracy, who resented the fact that all attention and resources were being poured into the Danubian wars. But the immediate trigger was a false rumor. At the beginning of the year 175, news spread across the eastern provinces that Marcus Aurelius, whose health had indeed been undermined by years of campaigning, had died on the Danube. Without waiting for confirmation, Avidius Cassius immediately proclaimed himself emperor. He was supported by the legions stationed in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Egypt was a vital region, the granary of Rome, and its loss could have caused famine in the capital and paralyzed the empire. Some ancient sources, notably Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, add a sensational detail to this story. According to their account, the rebellion was allegedly encouraged by the Empress Faustina herself. Concerned about her husband's frail health and fearing for the future of her young son Commodus should Marcus die, she supposedly entered into secret correspondence with Cassius and promised him her hand and the throne if the emperor passed away. This version is most likely malicious gossip, intended to tarnish Faustina's memory. Marcus himself never expressed the slightest doubt regarding his wife's loyalty, and after her death he insisted on her deification. When news of the rebellion reached Marcus' camp on the Danube, it came as a shock to all. Yet the emperor's reaction astonished even those closest to him. He did not give way to anger or despair. He gathered the soldiers and delivered a speech preserved by Cassius Dio in his Roman history. There was no hatred for the traitor in his words. On the contrary, Marcus expressed sorrow that he might be forced into a civil war. He declared that his only wish was to forgive Cassius should he repent, and to show the world how such a conflict might be resolved without bloodshed. "The only thing I fear, soldiers," he said, "is that he may either kill himself out of shame before facing me, or be killed by someone else. Then I shall be deprived of the greatest reward of victory, that of forgiving the man who wronged me." This was the speech of a true Stoic. Yet behind the philosophical calm lay sober calculation. Marcus understood that a civil war would be a death sentence for the empire. It would open the Danubian frontier to the barbarians and undo everything achieved at such terrible cost. He therefore acted swiftly and decisively. He concluded a hasty but advantageous peace with the Iazyges, abandoned plans to create new provinces, and immediately marched his battle-hardened Danubian army eastward. Fortunately for Marcus, the rebellion proved short-lived. As soon as it became clear in the east that the emperor was alive and advancing with his army, support for Cassius began to evaporate. The governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Verus, who remained loyal to Marcus, moved against the rebels. The Senate in Rome promptly declared Cassius a public enemy. The outcome was inevitable. 3 months and 6 days after the uprising began, Avidius Cassius was killed by his own soldiers, by a centurion named Antonius. His head was brought to Marcus Aurelius. According to the sources, the emperor refused to look at it, and ordered that it be buried with honor. He kept his word. With rare exceptions, none of Cassius' supporters were executed. Their property was not confiscated. Marcus even forbade the Senate from conducting an excessively harsh investigation. Cassius' children were spared and provided with a secure and dignified life. This act of clemency was unprecedented in Roman history, where rebellions usually ended in bloody proscriptions. Despite the swift suppression of the revolt, Marcus decided to travel personally to the east to restore order and loyalty in the provinces. His wife Faustina and his son Commodus accompanied him. This journey became another severe trial. Along the way, in the small village of Halala in Cappadocia, his beloved wife Faustina, who had accompanied him on all his campaigns and had received from the soldiers the honorary title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps, died suddenly. The cause of her death is unknown. It may have been illness, or perhaps an accident. For Marcus, it was a devastating personal loss. He founded a city on the site of her death, naming it Faustinopolis, and secured her deification by the Senate. He continued his journey, visiting Syria, where he showed mercy to the inhabitants of Antioch despite their support for the rebellion. He then traveled to Egypt. On the way, he stopped in Athens, the center of Greek philosophy, where he was initiated into the mysteries and established 4 state-funded shares of philosophy, for the Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean schools, granting their professors official salaries. It was a gesture of profound respect for wisdom, which remained his guiding star. In the autumn of 176, after nearly 8 years away, Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph, this time over the Germans and the Sarmatians. Beside him in the chariot rode his 15-year-old son Commodus, whom he elevated to co-emperor with the title of Augustus. Civil war had been averted. The East was pacified. It seemed that the exhausted emperor might finally find rest. But this was only a brief respite. The barbarians along the Danube, taking advantage of his absence, once again broke the peace. The final act of the tragedy still lay ahead. Rome welcomed its emperor with a triumph. After 8 years of war and turmoil, Marcus Aurelius returned to the capital as a victor. Yet on the face of the aging philosopher already lay the shadow of sunset. His health was broken, his soul wounded by loss, and before him stood the final, and perhaps most agonizing, question of his life, the question of succession. The system of adopted emperors that had granted Rome a century of prosperity was about to fail. At his side stood his biological son, Commodus. The choice Marcus would make would become his most controversial and tragic mistake. Was it blind paternal love, or a desperate attempt to prevent yet another civil war? That decision would shape the fate of the empire for decades and become the dark epilogue to the life of the philosopher on the throne. Returning to Rome in 176, Marcus Aurelius spent just over a year in the capital. It was a time of relative peace and attempts to restore normal life in a battered empire. He devoted himself to legislation, administered justice, and distributed generous financial aid to the population, seeking to ease the consequences of the crisis. He also published his notes on the Marcomannic Wars, which, regrettably, have not survived. The central event of this period was the rise of his only surviving son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus. Unlike his predecessors, Marcus had a direct blood heir, and he did everything to ensure a smooth and undisputed transfer of power. As early as 175, during Avidius Cassius's rebellion, he summoned the 14-year-old Commodus to the front and clothed him in the so-called toga virilis, the toga of an adult man. In 176, Commodus shared the triumph with his father, and in 177 Marcus took a decisive step. He granted his 16-year-old son the title of Augustus, making him a full co-ruler. This decision still sparks fierce debates among historians. Why did Marcus Aurelius, the quintessence of wisdom and insight, a product of the best system, choose as his successor a youth whose character already raised serious concerns? Commodus was the complete opposite of his father. He showed no interest in philosophy or state affairs. His passions were horses, gladiatorial games, and coarse pleasures. Physically strong and handsome, he was vain, capricious, and cruel. Why then did Marcus proceed with this choice? Likely several motives influenced him. First, the dynastic principle. The idea of hereditary monarchy was already deeply rooted in Roman consciousness. Refusing to pass power to his own son could have been perceived as a public humiliation and provoked instability. Second, the bitter experience of Avidius Cassius's rebellion. Marcus saw how easily a struggle for power could ignite at the slightest uncertainty. By appointing Commodus co-ruler, he sent a clear and unequivocal message to all potential usurpers. The succession question was settled. This was an attempt to prevent another civil war after his death, which he seemed to foresee. Third, paternal love and hope. Perhaps Marcus believed until the very end that he could educate his son, that the burden of responsibility would change him. He surrounded Commodus with the best advisers and tried to instill in him a sense of duty. In his meditations he thanks the gods that his son was neither feeble-minded nor corrupt. Perhaps he simply turned a blind eye to Commodus's worst traits, hoping for the best. Whatever the case, the choice was made. But peace in Rome lasted only briefly. In 178, the barbarians on the Danube, violating the treaties made before the Eastern campaign, once again invaded imperial territory. The Marcomanni and the Quadi rose again. The old and ailing emperor had to take up arms once more. On August 3, 178, Marcus Aurelius and his 17-year-old co-ruler Commodus left Rome and headed to the Danube frontier. This was his final war. The Second Marcomannic War was no less brutal than the first. Marcus again established his headquarters in Carnuntum and later possibly in Vindobona, modern-day Vienna. He acted decisively and successfully. The empire's greatest general at the time, Tarquinius Paternus, defeated a huge barbarian army. The Romans crossed the Danube once more and conducted operations on enemy territory. Plans to create the provinces of Marcomannia and Sarmatia were revived. Victory was near, but the emperor's strength was waning. Years of warfare, constant strain, personal tragedies, and perhaps the very plague that devastated his empire undermined his health. At the beginning of 180, he fell gravely ill. Realizing he was dying, he summoned Commodus and, in the presence of close friends and advisers, addressed him with a final speech. He urged his son to bring the war to a victorious end, to resist the temptations of luxury and power, and to heed wise counsel. On March 17, 180, at the age of 58, Marcus Aurelius died. The exact place of his death is unknown, either Vindobona or Sirmium in Pannonia. The probable cause was the Antonine Plague, though some later sources suggested poisoning organized by Commodus, but this remains unconfirmed. His last words, spoken to his servant who asked for the password of the day, were, "Go to the rising sun, for I am already at sunset." The emperor's body was transported to Rome. The Senate and the people mourned him sincerely. He was immediately deified. His ashes were interred in Hadrian's mausoleum. Throughout the empire, statues were erected in his honor, and many common people kept his images in their homes like icons. But with his death, an entire era came to an end. Barely awaiting his father's passing, Commodus promptly ended the war. He concluded a peace with the barbarians that many deemed disgraceful, abandoned all his father's conquests, and hurried back to Rome to indulge in pleasures and entertainments. The era of the 5 good emperors was over. The Golden Age gave way to the age of iron and rust, as the historian Cassius Dio had foretold. The philosopher on the throne had departed, leaving behind an empire standing on the threshold of chaos, and a son who would become one of the most insane and cruel tyrants in Roman history. The death of Marcus Aurelius was not merely the end of a reign, it was a symbolic watershed between two epochs. With him passed the classical era of Roman peace, a time of stability, lawfulness, and relatively enlightened rule. What followed was a long and painful process of decline that historians call the crisis of the 2nd century. The philosopher's legacy was almost immediately forgotten by his own son, and then by a series of soldier emperors who would tear the empire apart in their struggles for power. Marcus Aurelius's heritage proved deeply paradoxical. On one hand, as emperor, he left his successor a state exhausted by nearly 20 years of war and an unprecedented epidemic. Its financial system was shattered, its army weakened, and demographic losses irreplaceable. His most controversial decision, the transfer of power to Commodus, turned into a disaster. From this perspective, his reign can be seen as the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. Historians like Edward Gibbon viewed him as a noble but tragic ruler whose efforts merely delayed the inevitable collapse. But there is another side to his legacy, far more enduring and significant. This is not the legacy of the emperor, but of the philosopher and his reflections. That secret diary, written for himself in a campaign tent, outlived his empire and all subsequent epochs. This small book became one of the timeless bestsellers of world literature, a source of comfort and wisdom for countless generations. From Frederick the Great to Bill Clinton, from soldiers in the trenches of World War I to modern Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, people of widely varying faiths and professions have found in the words of the Roman emperor answers to eternal questions. What is the secret of this undying popularity? Marcus Aurelius offers no easy solutions or metaphysical revelations. His philosophy is profoundly practical. He teaches courage in the face of adversity, self-control in a chaotic world, and service to the common good in a selfish world. He shows by example that human dignity lies not in external achievements, but in inner integrity, in the ability to maintain clarity of mind and kindness of heart amid the most unbearable circumstances. Historical assessments of his personality vary. For some, he is the ideal philosopher on the throne, a Platonic dream realized. For others, a tired and somewhat rigid dogmatist whose adherence to Stoicism blinded him to reality, especially concerning his own family. Still others point to the cruelty of his wars and persecutions of Christians during his reign as proof that even the wisest ruler cannot avoid the bloodshed and violence inherent in power. But perhaps Marcus Aurelius's true greatness lies precisely in this tragic tension between ideal and reality. He was no god descended to earth. He was a man who fought every day, battling barbarians at the borders, plague in the cities, traitors at court. But his greatest battle was the one within his own soul. It was a struggle to preserve reason, mercy, and a sense of duty in a world gone mad. He did not ultimately win this battle. He could not save the empire from decline nor raise a worthy son. But the very fact of this struggle, immortalized on the pages of his diary, became his greatest victory and his undying legacy. The story of Marcus Aurelius is not one of success in the conventional sense. It is an eternal drama of a man who bore the weight of the world on his shoulders and carried it to the end, finding strength only in the power of his own spirit. And in this, his echo continues to resound through the corridors of eternity, reminding us that even in the darkest night, one can and must seek the light within.